Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, EFI, for the invitation. My name is Tati Michelleti, and I'm a research associate still at UBC, but I'm going to start next month, as they mentioned, at the Dresden University of Technology in Germany. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about SpaDES. So I would like to start with a short story. About 20 years ago, there was an ecologist who, together with other scientists, dreamed of a modeling tool that could do it all, could facilitate frequent predictions, perform model evaluation, a tool that would make models not only reproducible but reusable, a tool that would promote models to be free and accessible, and that would allow for interoperability with other models, and which would finally support continuous workflows that could be routinely tested. As he could not find any tools that would check all the boxes, he just had an idea. He decided to write his own. So he partnered with a postdoc, and they started to work on what would finally become SpaDES. So in August 2017, SpaDES made its way to CRAN. So perfect principles and SpaDES. Opening complex boxes, revealing secret handshakes, and making sure you can do it all over again and fast. Before we talk about SpaDES and perfect, we should probably talk about FAIR. So the FAIR principles for data were proposed by several scientists in 2016, and they stand for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Since then, these have also been used for models. And perfect is actually an expansion of the FAIR principles to modeling workflows. So perfect stands for making predictions, evaluating models, making models reusable, making models freely accessible, interoperable, within continuous workflows, and that are tested frequently. Perfect was defined in 2022 in the Ecology letters paper from McIntyre and collaborators, and is actually an appeal to the scientific community to accelerate the creation and the continued use of shared knowledge. So in a nutshell, perfect are the FAIR principles brought to a modeling workflow context, and also the foundational principles for which SpaDES was actually built. SpaDES is then the tool for implementing these principles. Here we can see an abstraction of the perfect principles. So we start from raw blocks. So for example, functions in R. And from that, we can actually build modules. These modules, they convey specific process or specific ideas. For example, data acquisition and treatment, parameterizing and fitting a species model, performing a post hoc analysis, and so on. So these modules can be then combined into models in the wide sense of the word, which can aim at answering specific scientific or even management questions. So SpaDES is actually the tool that makes it possible to reuse and recombine these pre-built structures. So what is SpaDES exactly? SpaDES stands for Spatially Discrete Event System, which means that each step or event actually happens as a snapshot. Originally, SpaDES had a focus on forecasting landscape changes. So for example, when we observe and collect data from landscape, we can use this data to build models. In this case here, we can see, for example, a caribou movement model, a wildfire, forest growth and mortality, and a human development model. And these models can in turn then be used to forecast the landscape into the future as a snapshot. But a dedicated simulation platform only does actually a small part of the project, arguably actually the simplest. We realized that we actually needed a platform that could deal with the whole workflow, going from data acquisition to treatment, to parameterization, to model fitting, predicting and or forecasting, to model evaluation, to post hoc analysis of results, to building figures and reports, to benchmarking, and finally to support decisions. So that's exactly what SpaDES became, a tool for perfecting workflows that is actually agnostic to modeling approach, and SpaDES actually enables the implementation of the perfect principles to the workflow from the start. More specifically, SpaDES is a tool for developing and sharing modular code based on the perfect principles. It supports the creation of SpaDES compatible modules, and it orchestrates their interactions. So modules are the central piece of SpaDES. We call them SpaDES modules. So these modules in this figure represented by the dashed rectangles, they represent standalone processes in the workflow. So for example, acquiring and preparing data, parameterizing, making model fitting, predicting or forecasting, evaluating models, making post hoc analysis, creating figures, create report, and potentially up to presenting results interactively. The hope is that this streamlined process, the streamlined workflow can help decision making and then get feedback from it to be iteratively improved. Technically speaking, SpaDES is an R meta package. It's composed of two main packages called reproducible and SpaDES.core. These two packages, they are part of a larger perfect universe, which has a collection of packages that include SpaDES tools that helps with providing the user with NetLogo and SALIS functionalities, functions to help set up projects, integrated projects like you can see in SpaDES.project package, functionalities to help replicate simulation experiments, to create shiny apps, and to provide efficient plotting. In a real-life context, if we think about the process of using models for decision-making, it would probably look like this a little bit. So step 1, acquire and wrangle data. Step 2, perform analysis and or simulations and produce a report. Step 3, last step, get the report to the hand of decision makers. The problem with this workflow, though, is that it's kind of disjunct. It's performed in chunks. It's going in one direction. And likely also performed by different teams. So it takes a lot of time to be able to rerun the workflow. It takes a lot of time to be able to change anything in there. So it's really not rare that once the decision maker is looking at the report, there is already new data available, we have already more precise modeling tools, and maybe we have even different priorities at the time. So what SpaDES does is that it helps us make this workflow more fluid. It allows for changes at different points of the workflow without actually compromising the whole system. It improves the speed to go from data to decisions. Now, the question many of you might be asking is SpaDES for me? Of course, that, as with any new tool, there is a learning process. However, this learning process is substantially reduced if the user has a good knowledge of R. So even though SpaDES can support module developed internally in other languages such as Python, for example, or C++, if the whole module is wrapped in a SpaDES template, it is accessible and transparent, and it's possible to debug it. So I prepared a short questionnaire to help you decide if SpaDES is actually something for you. So forecasting or landscape modeling are part of my work. My analysis scripts are very long or subdivided in many parts or steps. I want others to be able to understand, reproduce, and reuse my work. I want to integrate my work with other researchers. I want to be able to reuse and build on other researchers' works. I could use help to make my work more transparent and accessible. If you answer yes to one or more of these questions, SpaDES might be a good tool for your workflow. It's, of course, very important to highlight that SpaDES is not the first, not the only tool available that focuses on helping scientists build and perfect workflows. Two good examples of these are, for example, the tidyverse and targets. The difference, though, between these and SpaDES is that with the first ones, the focus is on controlling the workflow. With SpaDES, the workflow emerges from the modules. So this means that the user does not need necessarily to understand all modules in detail that are part of their workflow to be able to use them. In other words, each module is self-explanatory to SpaDES. It tells how it should be run, which data it needs, which data it produces, and the workflow actually emerges from these data dependencies. So the user can just watch what it unfolds when they put modules together. So lastly, but importantly, SpaDES is a long-term project, and it's in active development, which means that there is a pretty good community that is always ready to help. So SpaDES can speed up science and management. Sharing your work is good for you, for science, and for the world. To understand how SpaDES can help speeding up science and management, it's imperative to understand SpaDES' intrinsic modularity concept. So if you want, for example, to model a forest growth and mortality on a landscape that burns naturally, but you are a forest ecologist, there is a good likelihood that your forest model will be considerably more developed than your wildfire model, which makes sense because you're not a wildfire ecologist. However, on the other hand, if you are a wildfire ecologist, chances are that your forest model will be simplified while your fire model might be more developed. If you are a forest bird ecologist, then it's likely that both landscape models will be simplified in comparison to your species model. If all researchers are using SpaDES, the more developed models can be shared in a way that all three researchers can benefit from state-of-art models from areas outside of their expertise. So in other words, models coming from different areas of knowledge can be combined to answer important scientific and management questions. So if we have a large collection of interoperable modules, for example, we can quickly answer different questions just by reshuffling and recombining these pieces. For example, with the same basic landscape module, we can answer questions about caribou demographic trends or caribou resource selection. We can also reveal indigenous knowledge, or we can just answer questions about carbon budget under climate change. So the possibilities to explore scientific and management questions are endless. And that's what we've been doing in northern Canada within the Western Boreal Initiative. We have been using SpaDES to help bring in data to decisions. So the Canadian Western Boreal Forest is located in the northwestern part of the country, as you can see in the map. And from 2019 to 2020, we ran a pilot project in the Northwest Territories, focusing mostly on forecasting songbirds and boreal caribou habitat and demography under climate change. But the project worked so well that in the next 2 years, we expanded the area almost 5 times to cover the whole Western Boreal Forest. And we added to the birds and caribou harvesting pests such as spruce bloodworm and mountain pine beetle, carbon, and waterfowl. So our framework actually allowed us to ask and answer questions such as, with which mechanisms will climate change impact boreal land birds? Which actually led us to asking, how will boreal land birds abundance and distribution change throughout the century? And how will climate change impact boreal caribou? To putting several of these answers together and asking, what are the synergies for boreal caribou and land bird conservation? So here we see that due to this focus on modularity, SpaDES actually allows us to have the appropriate level of complexity in each project. We can go from simple projects to highly complex projects just simply by adding more modules representing either previously inexistent or simplified processes. So these results, for example, of these projects are then presented in a Shiny app, which is helping guide management decisions for this area at both local and at regional level. Our goal is actually to allow managers to identify the potential synergies and also trade-offs among different management scenarios and make decisions based on the best data and models available. And SpaDES can help us build this framework. So now that we've seen all the potential in using SpaDES, I'll try to demonstrate a very simple example of how SpaDES can help you perfect your workflow. So just before I share the RStudio, let's just go over the question that we are going to try to answer. So the objective of the simple project is to integrate 3 SpaDES modules and answer how does abundance of a species changes over time and as a function of temperature. We will then combine, for example, a species abundance module, let's say of platypus, just because they are pretty adorable, with a temperature module, and then we're going to combine this with linear model that is going to do some forecasting of abundance as a function of temperature. And here we can see the 3 modules in detail. The species abundance module is going to run from 2013 until 2022, which are the years for which we have data. Before the simulation actually starts, the module is going to download data, in this case, just because the user is not going to provide it. And then it's going to confirm that this data is in the right format that it should be. Then in the first year, the module will convert the table of coordinates, years, and counts to a raster. A raster is a graphic representation of this data in the form of a grid of pixels which have the individuals' counts as their values. And in the same year, this raster will be then appended to a list that will contain rasters for all the years, or technically speaking, a raster stack. And the module will then plot this raster data, and this will be done for every year that the data is available. Similarly to the abundance model, the temperature module will run from 2013, but up to 2032, which are the years for which we have data and forecasts of temperature. Before the simulation starts, the module will also download data and then confirm the data is in expected format, and it will then convert the table of coordinates, years, and temperatures to a raster and append it to a list that will contain rasters for all the years. And similarly to the other module, it will also plot the raster created, and this will be done for every year until the end of the simulation. At last, our linear model and forecast module will run from 2013 to 2032, but it will start by checking if abundance data is available. While abundance data is available, the module will just wait and check again in the next step. And the first year that the abundance data is not available anymore, the module will use the data from both previous modules up to that point, so up to 2022, and it's going to fit then to the full data set, a linear model, and perform then forecasts for each year of abundance. Data is not available, so any point in time after 2022, and plot these forecasts until the last year, when the module is actually going to plot the differences between the last year's forecast and the first year of abundance data. So in a nutshell, these are our 3 modules. So this is how the full workflow looks like in detail. So now we're going to go to RStudio. Before we do that, if you haven't yet downloaded the files, you can quickly do it now. Please just go to the short URLs to get them. The 2 files we're going to be needing at the moment are the demo.r and the demo.r and exploringspades.html. The first one, if you don't know GitHub, it's going to bring you to this web page, and you can download it by clicking this button here. The second one should just open on your browser. So once we have these files, the demo file is gonna have three parts. The first part, we will install the installers. The second part, we will download modules and install the packages required by these. And on the third part, we're gonna run SpaDES. So I strongly suggest using RStudio for this. That's what I'm gonna be using as well. So now to RStudio. So I hope everyone can see my RStudio screen. So if you can see here, this is the file that you also downloaded, demo.r. It's in my downloads folder. The only difference is that I cleaned it up a little bit, the first part of the comments. These modules, this simulation is gonna run only if you have the support for the Terra package. Otherwise, you would have to install extra packages, for example, GDAL and some other of these geo packages. But if you already use Terra, this should probably run straightforward. So as I mentioned, the first part is install the installers. Here, what we're going to do is just create a little function to get or update packages. We just make sure that we are all using exactly the same version of packages. So we are using the predictive ecology or universe to get these packages. We're going to install or update the remotes package. Then I'm going to proceed to install or update the require package. So require is actually a package that is available in CRAN. But the SpaDES project, which is the next package we need, is not, or not yet. It's making its way through. Because SpaDES project needs some of the newest features of require, we're going to install a version of require that can actually accommodate SpaDES project. So that's why we're installing from GitHub instead of CRAN. The last package that we're going to install or update is SpaDES project. If you ever install this project, these packages, you should see messages like, for example, skipping install of require from a GitHub because it's already installed and it didn't change. So this is part one. That's it. Part two, we will now download the modules we're going to use, and this code is also going to install all the needed packages by these modules. So for that, we're going to use the function setupProject available in SpaDES.project package. And we're going to provide only a couple of lines of code or information for our project. The first information we're going to provide is the path where we want our project to be set up on. So as you remember here, my file was downloaded, is still in the downloads folder. But I don't want my project to be hosted there. I want my project to be hosted in my documents folder, and I want it to be contained within this directory called integrating SpaDES modules. The second piece of information we're going to provide our simulation, our project, is the name of the modules we want to run together. In this case, because we're all going to get the modules from GitHub, we can see my username here and the name of the module, which coincides with the name of the repo, and at main means that it's in this branch name. If you are creating modules yourself, or if you're opting to download the modules and place them in your computer yourself manually, you could potentially just exclude this part, for example, like this, and here pass module equals whatever your modules are. Then SpaDES would find all the modules and it would combine, for example, local modules with modules being downloaded remotely. We're not going to do that today, but you're free to try. So we're still going to get everything from GitHub. And then we're going to provide a list of the start and the end times of our simulations. We're going to start in 2013 because that's when our data starts. And we're going to go all the way up to 2032 because that's how much data we have, the forecast of the temperature. And we're going to set restart to true. So we're going to see what this is going to do right now. So we're going to run this function. And here you can see that it set up the paths. I hope it's still, yeah. It set up the paths. It says that it updated the R profile. So this means that we're going to have a new library path for this specific project. It shows us all the paths that we have, for example, for inputs and outputs. It shows exactly where I wanted them, so inside this folder, and here we see the outputs. And when it's done setting the paths, it says restarting our studio inside the project and copied the demo.r file to the project folder. At last, it says starting a new R Studio session with project path as its roots. So if you manage to run this, if you manage to install the package and run this, you probably noticed that, let me just share my other screen. You probably noticed that R Studio opened up, sorry, just a second, that R Studio opened up a new project. You can see here on the right upper corner. We see already that it is the new working directory is exactly the project directory that we wanted. It created and opened a now project file. We can see here the demo.r file that it was copied to this directory. We can see it already opened it. And it gives you information about the library that it created specifically for this project, which is here, integrating SpaDES modules, packages, exactly the same structure of a normal R library. And it also tells you that if you don't want this, if you want to keep your library in one specific place for all your projects, you can just run this code and this will delete this library setting, and it will delete the R profile parts that it modified or the R profile file if it created it. So this means that your libraries for each project are going to be in a specific folder for each project, which is pretty helpful if you need different versions of packages for different projects. So now that we did that, we're going to rerun the script from the beginning, already starting in the right directory this time. You probably are going to have some package installation to be done. In my case, I already ran it, so my packages are installed. And now we're going to run again our setup project. So what happens here is that it sets up the paths again, but then it starts setting up the modules. So it downloads the modules, the 3 modules that we wanted. It downloads to our modules folder. We can see them here. The full modules are here. And at last, it installs any other dependencies that the modules require. So that means that any missing packages are going to be installed at this time. In our case, it says that SpaDES core and reproducible have been archived and they are not in CRAN anymore. So funny or not, this happened Saturday night because reproducible, we're not exactly sure why this happened because the packages are passing all tests. So we need to investigate, but they should be like briefly back on CRAN. But the good thing is that we have this possibility of installing the package also from the R universe, so from our version of CRAN, let's say. So once we ran this, now we go to the third part, which is actually running SpaDES, which actually happens with one line of code. So once we ran this setup, we have a list containing all the information that SpaDES is going to need for putting these modules together and running them. So as we run this, you can see the plots window. You can see the modules start running. It's downloading the data. And then it's going to start running the simulations and plotting our rasters on the screen. And we see the forecasted abundances, and in the end, we see the difference in abundance between 2022 and 2023 that we mentioned. So that is all that you need to do when you want to set up an integrated SpaDES project if you have the modules. It's important to mention that you don't necessarily need to use setup projects. There are many different ways you can set up your own project and download your modules, but this one is the easiest one and the most straightforward. And Elliot has been working really hard to get SpaDES project in CRAN, so everybody can use that. So now, if you still didn't get the other file, please look at the tiny URL that I'm posting here, webinar tinyurl.com/webinar EFI2. This should open in your browser, should open a HTML file. You can accompany what we are going to do right now with this HTML file. And I'm going to make some notes here while we are looking at everything here. So the first thing we're going to do is explore the results from the simulation. So first we're going to call SpaDES.core library, because so far we did not load the library. And first we're going to look at all the completed events that the simulation ran. So we can see, for example, the event time, the name of the module, the type of event, and event priority. And we can see also when that event started, when it ended on a clock time. And for example, we can see here in the beginning, for 2013, we have the init event, which is kind of an initiation event for all the three modules. And then we started having the species abundance module, doing the table to the rasters event and then plotting it. Temperature then comes in, data to rasters and plotting. Remember, species abundance temp LM, our last module, the linear model. It does the table building. It checks if species abundance still has data. When it does, it doesn't do anything. It waits for the next step. And then in 2014, it checks again and so on. Until 2022, when we know that we don't have species abundance data anymore. Here we can see species abundance temp LM building the table and then building the model and starting to forecast the abundance and plotting it. And then from here on, we see only the species abundant, the temperature modules running. So we can also see, for example, a module diagram showing us how the modules connect. So we have inputs that go to both the temperature and species abundance modules, and we have outputs from species abundance going to species abundant temp LM, our linear model module, and outputs from temperature going also there. We can also look at an object diagram, which we can follow the objects that are created. For example, we inputs, so our data produces the abund object and the temp object, abund object for the species abundance, temp for temperature. Species abundance produce then abund rest that goes to our last module, our linear model, and the temperature produces temp rest that goes there too. So SpaDES has a lot of functions that help you explore the connections between the modules and objects. And we can also look at the results now. So let me just first call Terra. And we can, for example, see the plots of our forecasts, because they are an object called forecasts saved in the results list. We can also plot the forecasted differences. We should probably add the title here. For example, so we can all explore all of the things that were produced within the simulation. So our next point is to add an evaluation module to make our workflow a little bit more perfect. All we have to do for that is add the module here. And we just rerun it. So now we see that while these three modules were already local, because we already downloaded it the last time we ran, now we downloaded the evaluate module, and we just rerun our call. Here you can see that it installed or loaded packages that this module needs. And here we can see our simulation running again. And at the end of the simulation, our new module is coming up. So if we want to check, it's taking a little bit longer. Let's see. There you go. Now we can see that it produces QQ plot and residuals versus fitted plot. And there we go. So if we want to see the results from that, for example, we can go to the results, which is a list. I'm going to talk about this special list afterwards. We can see this object, mod diagnostics, is the object produced by this new module. And we can see that it provides a couple of diagnostics for the model, our abundance as a function of temperature, like a summary, It produces and saves both plots. So we can see here, when we go to the outputs folder, we can see the plots are being saved here. And residuals versus fitted is also there, cross-validation, and so on. So now the third thing we can do is to remove modules without breaking the workflow. So let's say we want to remove the abundance module and we want to remove the linear model. We just remove them, we rerun, and there we go. We have only the two modules that we selected running. Important to note is that there's a warning there because evaluate LM module expects this object called abund temp LM, which is produced by the species abund temp LM module. And as we are not running it, it doesn't have it, so it wants to use a simulated data, so you can keep working. It doesn't break the workflow. You can keep working on the module with the results if you want to. But there's no much sense in running this module alone. But now we can, for example, run just the species abundance one. Oops. I forgot a comma here. Just run this. And there we go. We have plotting happening, and we see here only our species abundance module. So the next point we're going to explore is testing. So I'm going to show, for example, that in our species abundance module, we have a folder called tests, and we have a file here called unit tests, and inside the test.dat folder, another file full of tests. So we're going to call this one, and it's going to run all the tests that are inside this folder and tell me tests passed. So that means that the module is actually working as we expected. At last, we're going to be modifying modules. So we're going to stick to the species abundance one, and we're going to be modifying it. So don't freak out. There is a lot of code and text here. We're going to do it step by step. So the first part, we just open a little bit more here so we have more room. So there are 4 things we need to do when we want to modify a module. Oops. First thing is create the function that we want to use in the module that we want to modify. The second thing is to add this function either to an existing event or to create a new event for this function. The third thing is to schedule this event. And the fourth thing is to declare this, whatever this new function creates as a created output. So these 4 steps can let you, can help you change the module and get a good sense of keeping everything in place and working. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new function. So we're going to try to find here where the functions are. And here we have a section in the module where all the functions of the module are kept. Alternatively, you can put them into the R folder. It's for bigger modules, it's way more organized. So we're just going to add here our new function. The second thing is that we're going to create here a new function. We're going to create a new event for that function. So that's going to look like this. We're going to call our event abundance through time, and we're going to simply put the function, call the function that we created using this abund object, and we're going to create a mod abund object, and we are going to put it into the sim. So the sim is a special list that has all the information about all modules, parameters, inputs, and outputs. That's the heart of SpaDES. And finally, we're going to schedule this event to happen. And we are scheduling it to happen at the end of the simulation. Here we have the name of the module and the name of the event. We do this scheduling in the init event. And the last thing is to create an object, because that's the object we're creating. We're declaring, and now remember here down, we're creating this mod abund. So we need to declare it up there at the metadata. So these 4 simple steps: we save the module, we rerun it, and we have our modified module running. Here you can see that the last event, abundance through time, created the object mod abund. That's it. That is a way of modifying an existing module and keeping the workflow completely intact. So these were the things that I wanted to show for now in our studio. We're going to go back now to the presentation. Just a second. There we go. So believe it or not, with these 2 function calls, we actually demonstrated all principles from PERFICT in this simple example. We demonstrated the predictions when we saw completed projects with their respective forecasts. We evaluated the model that we were using, the linear model, when we added a module evaluation module. We changed the modules code, so we showed that I showed that it is reusable. Everybody could download it and have full access to the code, so it is freely accessible. We showed that the modules, I showed that the modules are standalone or possibly integrated. Continuous workflow, showing from data to completion into function calls. And I showed you how you can put your models to test, so you can test your models. So quickly looking under the hood, for those that are interested in knowing a little bit more into detail what's going on in the modules. So this is what a module looks like. It is a directory. It has, for example, for the module species abundance, a templated script, citation, license, news, readme, a manual file, and data, R, and tests folder. For those who are acquainted with R packages, this might look pretty familiar, and it actually should. SpaDES module structures, they do remind us of R packages because R packages have a good level of fairness embedded in them. So interestingly resembles an R package, and it can be converted to one. So now you might be asking, okay, but how do I create a new module from scratch then if I want to? So pay attention. New module, name of the module, and the path where you want the module to be created. And that's it. So let's go back quickly to our studio. And let's test this. module called, let's say, my cool module, and we wanted it to be placed in the same folder as we have our other modules. Oops. Let's just copy it. And we put them in the modules folder. There you go. Press enter, and that's it. So SpaDES tells you here, new module called my cool module, created in this folder, so in this directory. It tells you how to edit it, what you should do, and it tells you if you want to do it in R right now, you can just run file edit, and your module is there. So here is the module template. You can just fill it up out with whatever you want your module to do. And here you can see my cool module with all the files that belong to a SpaDES module. That's it. Simple as that. So now we go back to the presentation for analyzing it. So this is the simplified anatomy of a module. It has two parts, as I mentioned, a metadata and an events part. The metadata can be subdivided into parts, functional and descriptive. Descriptive metadata has name, description, keywords, and authors, and version. Functional metadata, packages, parameters, inputs, and outputs. These two being very important for connecting modules. So for example, module Y needs object C, module Z produces object C, so they connect in this way. And the events part does two things. So it describes what you want to do, simply as do something within the brackets. For example, a function applied to data, it creates data too, and we assign this to the sim list. And it also can schedule itself, as we saw before. So the sim list is a very important object, as I said, is the heart of SpaDES. And it holds all the information needed for SpaDES to schedule events and to remember module orders and everything. So this means that if an event needs to use an object produced by, for example, another module, it will find this object in the sim list. So if an event is creating an object, this object should be stored in the sim list. That's how modules can use and modify each other's objects. So for example, a landscape where forest grows and fire burns, the fire burning the forest is going to modify the landscape, and the forest growth module can then grow forest potentially with other properties. So inside these events, you can write pretty much any functions that you want, anything that you would write within a normal R script. Even, as I said, if it means calling functions in Python with the package Reticulate, or in C++ with the package RCPP, and so on. All we need to remember is that the order of the execution of the event will be given by the order of scheduling. There are some fine-tuning on the scheduling possible, but this is probably something for a more in-depth workshop. So, take-home message. SpaDES is a tool that can help implement the perfect principles to modeling workflows. In SpaDES, the workflow emerges from the module's metadata, regardless of how complex the workflow is. Module quality is responsibility of module developers, not users. And at last, SpaDES supports the development of perfect, fair workflows with the right level of complexity and flexibility helping researchers bring data to decisions. That's what I had planned for today. So thank you so much for being here. Before we dive into any questions, I would really appreciate if you all could take a couple of minutes, probably 2 minutes, and just fill out this survey for us. That would help us improve SpaDES tutorials and vignettes for people wanting to use it. And the survey can be done anonymously, and you can also, if you have interest, you can put your email address and you can subscribe to our mailing list and discussion groups. So you can find the survey in the tiny URL and also the QR code. And thank you very, very much for being here today.
Hey, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. So we do have a few questions. One, can you use nonlinear models in this package?
You can use absolutely any models you want. You can, anything you can code in R, you can just wrap up with a SpaDES module, in a SpaDES module. You can use pretty much anything that you are using in your code already. You can just wrap it within the events, and they just work.
That's fantastic. How do you add spatial scales like county level or CBG level to the model? And I think this is a good example. Can you add other climatic variables like rainfall?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, SpaDES is more of a tool than it is of a model. So if you remember the SpaDES structure figure that I posted in the beginning, that I showed in the beginning, any data preparation, any download of data, you can do anything within a SpaDES module framework. So yes, you can use any shapefiles for county, for country, for region. You can download and use any kind of climate data, because it's not a model itself, it's a structure for you to build your workflow and to manage your workflow from the beginning to the end. So including data download up to reporting.
That's fantastic. There are two other questions about models specifically. Okay, actually, this is a great question. So that is, you can wrap any of your R code in a SpaDES module. Can you call C++ functions or models or Python?
Yes, absolutely. You can, as I mentioned, exactly Python and C++. As long as you can call in our session, for example, the reticulate package for Python code or RCVP for C++ code. And if you can make it work in your R code, then you can make it work in SpaDES. So it's just porting that R code to SpaDES, encapsulating, let's say, that R code in a SpaDES module.
Wonderful. I have a question. So I know that, SpaDES workflows come from a, long experience of writing code and trying to organize it and trying to understand. Can you quickly mention sort of your initial experience of how you used to code and how you used to put everything together pre-SpaDES workflow, and how it led you to really thinking like, okay, you know what, my life is much better because I'm implementing this workflow now?
Yeah, I think I can give a pretty good example. It was actually my first task as a postdoc back in 2017 when I started my postdoc with Elliot at the PFC, the UBC. I was tasked to, let's say, retrieve an analysis from a previous postdoc and move from there a little bit further. So I thought, okay, maybe I can do that like 2-3 weeks. And to be really fair, the postdoc was awesome, but he did all his analysis in a mix between ArcGIS and R. Downloading data manually, downloading files manually, and so on and so forth. But he did take note on every single step he did. So when I saw the script, I was like, yeah, perfect. Like, it's going to be super quick and easy. except it took me 9 months and I couldn't get to the result that he had. And that's because uh, of these, what we call the secret handshakes, right? We see the first data file and we find, oh, this point looks a little bit weird. Let's just clean it up. But you forget to actually document that you actually took one point out, or you change something in your workflow. You click on this place and then you put an option that you forget to mention. You put the option on, and so on and so forth. This happens. This is very normal to happen. And then I said, okay, I cannot even repeat this. How can I move forward with this? No? And that's when I actually personally started to be very grateful for SpaDES, because everything that I did to try to repeat this postdoc's work was actually there. So once I finally managed to get to the end of it and get to the exact same results that he did, the next time I just rerun everything. I gave to my supervisor, he rerun it. Everybody could run the code. Everybody could get to the same result. And that's when you start being very aware of this reproducibility challenge. We all think, yeah, I'm reproducible. Here, I'm scripting everything. But in the end, there are a lot of little steps that sometimes, and little decisions we sometimes make, that if they are not in the workflow, very explicit, for example, in the case of the metadata, what is this object again? What does it do? What is the format supposed to be? If they are not there, it's really hard sometimes to try to understand what was done. So I think that's kind of my first, okay, SpaDES is something that I'm going to use for the rest of my life while I code.
That definitely describes a lot of how I think we all go through, getting the data, cleaning the data.
Oh, yeah.
Odd data point, and we ask, even if you don't know about the system, the data point still looks strange. And yes. No, this was fantastic. Jody, we have one more minute, or?
Yeah, we've got more time, and actually there's one more question that came in.
Okay. So like I said, there's two questions I haven't asked, but they're model specific questions.
Okay.
And so like you mentioned, SpaDES isn't necessarily just for like it's not a model, it's a framework. But this one says, can you give an example of working with collaborators where one person group is developing one module and another person group is developing a different module? It seems like there are a lot of pros to use SpaDES, but there are pitfalls to be aware of when multiple modules are separately developed.
Yeah, there needs to be a little bit of either a collaboration between the two groups. If they are, for example, developing at the same time, they could talk to each other to understand their inputs and outputs, to see how this could be connected. One could be connected to the other. But there are also pretty cool tools within the SpaDES, in SpaDES core, for example, or SpaDES tools that you can, for example, if you have two modules that were already done by two different groups, and they have, for example, different names, the objects have different names. It's a very simple situation, but that can happen if you don't coordinate. There are tools that you can pass like a name equivalency. So if you find this name in a module, that means that. And that is the name that you use in your module, for example. So there are ways of integrating these modules. And another potential way that I tend to use a lot when I'm integrating a lot of models is creating an integration module, which, for example, translates, for example, one output to the format I need as an input on the other module. That can also happen, for example. So you create just an extra module that just translates one output from one to the input of the other. So there are a lot of different ways you can integrate modules from different groups. We've been doing this for a little bit of time. A lot of modules being developed by a lot of different people, researchers focusing on wildfire, researchers focusing on forest biomass, researchers focusing on caribou and land birds and so on. And yeah, there is a little bit of coordination that helps a lot if you can have this coordination. But even if the coordination is not there, because everything the module needs is in the module has all the information, you can also integrate it in your workflow with a little bit of reading of the module that works.
That's fantastic. So if we have a few more minutes, I'll ask the model questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one asks, can you handle rasters of different sizes and scales? And is the final predictive model at the scale of the most coarse raster file?
So yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't show, so to be fair, presenting SpaDES in 90 minutes is not easy. We always aim for a 5-day workshop. When we don't have the 5 days, 3 days, but we have a lot of functions that can be used, for example, to do any needed adjusting of, for example, different scale data, geographic information data. So one of the functions that I use like in every one of my modules is called PERFICT Inputs. It's a combined function that you can provide, for example, a study area and a raster that you want any rasters to be matched in terms of resolution and in terms of extent. And PERFICT Inputs just gets your input from a URL, for example, hosted in a government website or in Google Drive, and it downloads your input, it crops, it reprojects, it fixes errors, which is very important as well. These, I don't know, for people that work with GIS, these slivers that sometimes appear in spatial objects, it fixes those errors and it gets to the projection that you actually want it to be. So either by resampling to a higher resolution or to a lower resolution. So it's a function actually inside the package, reproducible. But yeah, so with the help of this function, you can definitely choose whatever resolution you want for your work.
That's great. One more question. For data where you have a single raster file per year of corresponding environmental data, does this current workflow match something like raster name to match the year for each data point?
Yeah, I can do that too. So remember that SpaDES is just this template encapsulating whatever code you have. So if your code is getting for each year your raster name, so named raster, you can have the name appended to the raster, to the outputs without a problem. Any code you can write in R can be put it into a SpaDES module. that's the short version of it.
Fantastic. And I guess that's like a test to everyone listening in and watching this in the future. You know, push the limits of what you can do in a SpaDES.
Absolutely, please do. And if you find any errors, if you find any problems, if you have difficulty starting, in the repo from the webinar, I posted also one hands-on file that gives a little bit more information about the module and gives a little bit more information on how you can fill out this template, this module template, to try to build your own module. And you can also fill issues in GitHub if there is a module that is not working, or if you're having difficulties with anything any of the material that I presented today, and I put it in the repository. Please, you can write me an email. That's also not a problem. We have the Google groups, which is a larger community that can also help you with any trouble. Yeah, so just please let us know if you're having any issues. We can try to sort it out. Our idea is that in a perfect world, a lot of people would be using SpaDES. A lot of researchers would be building their modules and sharing their modules, and we can have a huge collection, and we can accelerate both science and decision making with those.
Fantastic. Yes, I definitely hope that more people will, start working with spades and like you said, being able to reproduce something instantly that someone else has just completed is something, that we're all working toward.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Fantastic.